Hello, everyone. I'm Tricia Baker. I'm Executive Director of Human Resources for GCFA here in Nashville. I am going to be going over some information regarding the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, if you're familiar with that. And that is the federal requirement, basically the federal wage and hour law. We previously did a webinar a few months ago regarding the upcoming salary threshold changes that were coming through, and that was kind of the urgent change that was taking place. As most of you probably know, that decision was struck down by a federal judge. So those salary threshold changes are actually not taking place. So the July 1 change is not taking place. The January 1 change is not taking place. So we are going to use this time together to talk about what is required under the FLSA, because nothing really changed except for the salary threshold test. And then we're going to talk about some things that best practices for you as an administrator for your organization, and kind of keeping up with the timekeeping requirements that are already in place and that we should be abiding by. I do want to say that we do not provide legal advice. I am not an attorney. We make every effort to give you a comprehensive and accurate presentation. But if you have really specific issues regarding wage and hour laws, we recommend that you reach out to an employment attorney, because as will say several times through this presentation, state laws also come into play and they vary across the board. So again, not legal advice. We're just going to go over some best practices and some information for you. So regarding the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, that is the federal wage and hour law. So this is already in place. This has been in place. And these requirements have been kind of necessary for organizations for the past several years. So the FLSA has 4 basic requirements. It requires that all employees be paid at least the federal minimum wage, which is $7.25. It has not changed since July 2009, I believe. Now, the minimum wage may be higher in some states, but the federal minimum wage is $7.25. So if you are in a state that has its own minimum wage, you do need to pay the higher of those two as a minimum wage to your employees. It also requires that certain employees be paid an overtime rate of pay if they work over 40 hours within a work week. So if they work over 40 hours, they are required to be paid overtime pay. And that is for, again, some employees who are our hourly staff members. The FLSA has some requirements regarding record keeping for non-exempt staff or hourly staff members, and also for exempt staff. And we'll talk about that a little later. And then the 4th provision of the FLSA is child labor laws, which most of us probably don't have, probably all of us don't have. But if you do, those specific requirements are on the FLSA website, and also the required federal poster for wage and hour laws. So if you need to look at that specific information, it is available. So currently, who has to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act? There are a few different tests to determine if your employees do have to comply with the FLSA. So the first test is basically called enterprise coverage, and it discusses if an employee works for a business that does sales or business volumes over $500,000 a year. That is not going to be our religious organizations in terms of churches, conferences, things like that. Now, if it's a nonprofit organization that sells products, that may be, they may fall under this requirement. But for the most part, most of us kind of at the church level would not meet that threshold. However, there is what's called individual coverage, which means if your employees engage in interstate commerce, you do have to comply with the FLSA. And that's a grand term for basically any work that crosses state lines. So do they make calls across state lines as part of their work? Do they open mail that comes from other states? Do they send emails across state lines? Do they, get on Zoom calls with individuals who are in other states? So more than likely, pretty much everyone that works for in an administrative role or works in the organization is probably going to be under the FLSA normally. So we'll just keep that in mind as we go through this information. There's no exemption overall for a religious organization. Now there is what is called a ministerial exception, and we'll talk about that later on. But in terms of just employees working in an organization that engage in interstate commerce, they would fall under the FLSA. So there are two categories of staff members under this federal law. Exempt staff members are those that are not eligible for overtime pay. They're paid on a weekly salary basis. And non-exempt employees are those that are eligible for overtime pay. So hourly non-exempt staff members must track their time on a daily basis at minimum, and they must be paid time and a half for any hours worked over 40 in a work week. So I want to talk about the work week. Hopefully you already have a designated work week and you say our work week is from maybe Sunday to Saturday or Monday through Sunday. It has to be set. It can't change week over week or month over month because you don't want to appear that you're trying to get out of paying overtime. But you have a set work week that is communicated to employees and may be on a required state poster. It may be in a policy, but it is communicated to staff members. And then if an employee works over 40 hours and they are non-exempt hourly, they work over 40 hours in a work week, they have to be paid time and a half for any hours worked over 40 in that work week. So you couldn't say, okay, you worked over 8 hours. I'm going to give you 8 hours off next week. You cannot do that. If they worked over 40 in a work week, they have to be paid time and a half their hourly rate. Now, again, I want to focus on the term hours worked because vacation, sick, holiday, or PTO time, those don't count toward the count for overtime. Those are considered hours that are paid that are not worked. So if an employee has 36 hours worked and then 8 hours of holiday pay, they would not receive overtime because their hours worked does not exceed 40 in that work week. So this is the requirement, again, the federal requirement. Your state may have more strict laws in terms of how you designate who gets overtime, but the general, again, federal requirement is based on a work week. So when it comes to hourly staff members, you have to keep specific records of that employee's information and also their hours worked each day. So you as the employer can decide any timekeeping method that you choose. So it could be a time clock, it could be an online timekeeping system, it could be a paper time card if you don't have an online record keeping system, but you have to have hourly staff members keep track of their hours that they work. So whatever method you choose should be consistent for all hourly staff members. And then you would need to keep records of their pay information as well. There's a lot of information online about record keeping because you do have to keep specific information, but the most important thing to remember is your weekly timesheets, hours worked per day, and then you also have to keep information about the employee's rate of pay. What is their hourly rate of pay? Because you have to say what is time and a half and what's your overtime rate going to be. And then your employees should have access to that information and they should know what their hourly rate of pay is, how many hours they're scheduled to work per week. A lot of the organizations throughout the connection maybe have a 36-hour work week, 37-hour work week, and that's fine. That's what employees are scheduled to work. If they work between, let's say, 37 to 40 hours, that would not be overtime in terms of time and a half, but it would be over maybe your budgeted amount for that role. So maybe that's something they would need to discuss with their supervisor. But regardless of how you set your work week, again, 40 hours is the threshold for overtime. Now, something important to note, your payroll records must be kept for at least 3 years. And that's from the date of entry. If you enter time or enter pay, you have to keep that information for 3 years. Time cards must be kept for 2 years. And this is, again, a record keeping requirement on a federal level, but also if you were to have someone that went to the Department of Labor and said, I haven't been paid appropriately, I've been working overtime and I've not been compensated for it. Well, one, the Department of Labor is going to come and look at your records and you want to have those still. But also you want to make sure that you're clear in your policies that you do not allow working off the clock. You do not allow things like that. So these are important things to have in terms of what you need as an employer. If someone does go to the Department of Labor and say they've been required to work off the clock, working off the clock, or they're designated as exempt when they're not truly exempt, the Department of Labor could go back 2 or 3 years and require you to pay back pay to the employee. And sometimes that's at 2 times the rate they should be paid because it's liquidated damages. They can be very costly lawsuits. So just keep that in mind. It's very important to keep your records, and it's very important to have policies that outline that you are complying with the FLSA in terms of your staff. So in order for someone to be exempt, you cannot just say, okay, well, we're just going to make you salaried. We're just going to pay you a flat salary, and then you just work as many hours as you need to. There are specific tests that you have to essentially have the position pass in order to consider someone exempt. So what kind of work do they do? There's a job duties test, which we will go in detail on. How are they paid? They have to be paid on a salary basis, which means if they leave 2 hours early on a Tuesday to go to the doctor, you don't deduct 2 hours from their pay. They would still receive their weekly salary if they are truly exempt. And how much are they paid? So currently it's $684 per week, which is about $35,500. That is what changed regarding the federal requirements. So that was increased, and that went into effect on July 1. There was an increased salary threshold. That is all that changed, though, was the increased salary threshold. So in terms of the job duties test and the salary basis test and the record keeping and the overtime, that has all been consistent in terms of the federal requirements. So they did try to increase again that salary threshold, but that has been struck down. So it is back to $684 per week. Again, an employee's position has to pass the job duties test to be considered exempt. So it doesn't matter if they make $60,000 a year. If they are not meeting the job duties test, they are legally entitled to overtime, and you need to pay them an overtime rate for any hours worked over 40. So the first of the exemptions I'm going to talk about is the executive exemption. And this is essentially someone who is in a position, they oversee a department, they oversee the organization. They have control over a group of individuals or a division of the organization. They must have at least 2 direct reports that they manage in terms of day-to-day work, and they directly manage the work of, again, at least 2 employees. So just having 1 direct report isn't enough under this test. And they must have hiring and termination authority. So that doesn't mean that they can just decide by themselves you're fired and send someone home. You may have an approval process where you talk it through with leadership. But if they recommend a termination or a hire, you give weight to their recommendations. So they have to have a say in the hiring and termination processes. So they have to meet all 3 of these requirements in order to meet the executive exemption job duties test. The administrative exemption is one of the most common exemptions, and it's important to note it is administrative, but it's not someone in an administrative role, an administrative assistant. It's not determined by job title. It's determined by these 3 factors. So the primary duty of the staff member must be related to office or non-manual work, directly related to the business operations of the employer or their customers. They also have to exercise discretion and independent judgment in respect to matters of significance. And these are kind of vague terms. I realize this, and if you would look on the FLSA website, you would see that they also list this information there. But it's matters of significance in terms of how much they can do on behalf of the employer. Do they require, independent decision making? Can they make a financial decision on behalf of the employer? Can they go into agreements on behalf of the employer? It's not, if they make an error, it's going to cost money, because that may be a forklift driver or something like that. That's not it. That they can act on behalf of the employer on matters of significance. So some examples of areas that may fall under the exemption are accounting, tax, finance, some HR positions, benefits administration, if they are actually making decisions related to the benefits roles or benefits vendors, things like that. Computer networking. So some computer positions are exempt under this requirement, but they have to have higher level computer experience. So they work directly with software, developing information, database work, things like that, not just your simple help desk position, because those have actually been listed as non-exempt positions because they are working in troubleshooting and things like that. So again, these are the requirements to fall under the administrative exemption. Again, matters of significance and independent judgment. So can they go out and enter into agreements or make decisions on behalf of the employer? And then the third exemption is a professional exemption, and this is really where their position requires advanced knowledge, which is intellectual in nature. So it's really things that are in a field of science or learning. So your doctors or attorneys, things like that. They have to have a specialized course of study. So again, probably not in our organizations, but very specialized advanced degrees are required to fall under the professional exemption. So there are other exemptions. If someone is, again, doing systems analysis or designing software, they would fall under the computer employee exemption. And then there is an outside sales exemption, which we would not have, but it has have certain criteria. So regarding the salary basis test, so this was one of the 3 tests to be exempt. Employees must receive a predetermined amount of compensation weekly, or on a less frequent basis. So you say your weekly salary is X, or your annual salary is an amount, but it does have to equate to at least $684 per week. And then you can't reduce their salary based on the quality or the quantity of work. So your policy may be that, exempt staff members' schedules are based on, their workload or their need to get things done, because they're not entitled to overtime, but there is a little more flexibility in the hours that they work per week. So if they were to, again, leave 2 hours early on a Tuesday, you cannot deduct 2 hours from their pay. Now, if they're absent an entire day, you may be able to reduce their salary by an entire day. If it's something for like a medical leave of absence or some sort of leave that you have a policy related to, and you've stated that this is how you're going to take deductions regarding that. You can replace their pay with PTO or vacation or sick time. So you can say, okay, you're taking a half day. You need to use 4 hours of PTO, as long as you're supplementing that salary so that they are not receiving a reduced amount. And then if they did not work at all during a week, then they would not have to be paid their salary. But again, you need record keeping and policies around how that is administered. So again, you can take deductions from pay on a full day basis if they are absent for a sickness or a disability, or a personal reason. If they have to be out for an entire day, they don't have time to supplement that. But if they do work during the day, they should be paid for that work day. And then if they are, if you're supplementing with PTO or sick leave or something like that, if they've exhausted all of that time, then they can take absences in whole day increments, and then they could be unpaid. But again, you can't take partial day reductions in their pay. So the update from the Department of Labor, like I said, is that the salary threshold changed. That went away. So that is not in place anymore. So we talked about, if somebody was exempt and they weren't making at least the salary threshold, then you had to potentially make them non-exempt or take them up. You no longer have to do that. It's gone back down again to 35,568. So again, but they do have to meet the job duties test. So I do encourage you to, 1, have accurate job descriptions for your staff members that list the duties, so that you can say this position is exempt because of these job duties, individual discretion, and matters of significance. So you want to make sure you're listing the requirements for the job, if it's education, if it's experience, years of experience, and what the role primarily does. But again, the salary threshold is back down. Now, if someone is making over 35,000 and their duties don't meet the test, they can be hourly. They would need to receive overtime pay for, the hours that they worked, and you need to keep their hours tracked. So the 35,000 is only in consideration for if someone's going to be exempt. Someone can make over that and be non-exempt, and that's perfectly fine. So again, the changes that took place on July 1. So if you raised someone's salary on July 1 to keep them exempt, I encourage you to think through how you're going to move forward, because probably not a best practice to say, oh, they struck down that law, we're going to take back $5,000 so that, you go back down in your salary. You want to think through, one, how you keep them at that salary level that you've planned for. Any other changes that you were planning for, you may not have made. That's another thing to consider. But you want to think about how you kind of live into these payroll adjustments that you've already made. And then if someone, maybe drops to non-exempt, maybe you review their duties before changing them back to exempt, because they had that lower salary. Maybe consider their job duties and are they truly in an exempt level role, or maybe they were categorized incorrectly before, and then this can just be a new way forward, having them non-exempt to being in compliance. So just consider that. And part of this salary threshold change was that the minimum salary requirement was going to be evaluated every 3 years, based on the current, salaries in the regions of the United States that were lower earning. They have decided they struck that down as well. So the salary threshold has gone back to what it is, and there's no idea if it will change or anything that could be upcoming. So some things to consider for your next steps. We don't recommend reverting salaries back to pre-July 1 pay, but that is a possibility. Or if someone was made non-exempt, you can leave them there. Or maybe you did raise their salary and you're going to say, okay, well, maybe we freeze your salary because you are making a higher rate than you were, and we're going to kind of keep you there until, maybe we catch up with our cost of living adjustments or the adjustments for other staff. Just think through how you want to move forward and what would be the most fair for your staff. Before changing their status, one, again, make sure they're truly exempt in terms of their job duties, but you want to document the change. You want to make sure you are showing, on their job description or in a letter to them what their amount of pay would be, and that they would be considered exempt or non-exempt if you are making that change or going back or making a change in pay. Also make the change at the beginning of a pay period, because you don't want half of the pay period to be salaried and half to be hourly or vice versa. Make sure you're just making those changes in a clean way at the beginning of a pay period. Another thing to consider is in terms of your policies, you may have different PTO requirements for your staff members who are exempt versus non-exempt. So is making a change to their status going to change their PTO balances? Is it going to change anything related to their employment? Be prepared to have those conversations. Hopefully if it's someone, you already changed someone's rate of pay or their status in July, you already kind of know that, and you're prepared to have future conversations about their status changes. But just something to note, is it changing their record keeping status? Do you have to keep more information on them regarding their hours, rate of pay, things like that? Do you have that information in your payroll system or in your payroll files? And then make sure you're training staff appropriately, so managers know, if they have an exempt staff member, they can't reduce their pay by 2 hours if they clock out early. They have to be paid on a salaried basis, or, hourly staff members have to be paid for all hours worked. Regarding break laws, so not the federal law does not require breaks for staff members. However, state laws may require that. So for example, in Tennessee, if an employee works 6 consecutive hours, they have to receive a 30-minute unpaid meal break. And that means they are not working. They are away from work. They are taking a true break. They are not paid, and then they're able to come back. If you have a policy related to break times, just make sure it's clear that your hourly staff members are not working during that time. And this is where employee and manager training is really important, because you want your managers to know they have an hourly staff member. If they are off the clock, if they're at home at night, or if they're on their lunch, they should not be working. So managers, if there's an emergency, maybe the expectation is, if there's an emergency, I may text you and you can clock in and do whatever the emergency work is. But day to day, if you're off the clock, you do not log in and check emails. You do not take calls. You are off the clock. And it's important for the manager to have that expectation of the staff, and the staff to know what's expected of them in terms of being paid for all hours worked. So again, managers, if they approve your time cards, which is the best practice, if they approve their staff members' time cards, maybe they know they got an email from their staff member on Tuesday at 8 o'clock. They need to be looking at the time card and saying, hey, staff member, I noticed that you were emailing Tuesday night, but that's not on your time card. Can you please go in and add that time? And they need to know what to look for in terms of their staff members and what to expect. So just something to know there. Also, some of those break laws, it states, pertain only to non-exempt staff members. So Tennessee's an example. That law pertains only to non-exempt staff members. So if someone went from exempt to non-exempt, they may have to start taking a lunch because they are required to do so or entitled to that under state law. And they have to get in that mentality when they've been exempt and they are used to just kind of eating lunch when they can. So just several things to consider. And regarding your policies, if you do have a policy, you can list the core office hours of when exempt staff are expected to be working, maybe that their schedules based on their workload, or, hourly staff members work from 8 to 4:30, but you want to have clear, concise policies that say, here are the expectations. And, we do abide by the Fair Labor Standards Act and relevant state laws. So that's something, this is a good opportunity to look at that information and make sure you are up to date on that. So I did have some questions that came through, so I do want to back up. I want to say, if you do have questions, you can list those. If it is something where you think you might not be doing something right, and you have a question about a specific employee, we may not want to do that on this webinar. You can reach out to us separately. But again, we do want to take some questions that have come through. I do want to say before we move on, one thing that we did not cover in this webinar that we did last time is the ministerial exception. And basically, if someone is operating in a ministerial role, whether they're ordained or not ordained, that really isn't relevant in terms of this capacity. If they're operating in a ministerial role, then the Fair Labor Standards Act, the federal requirement for minimum wage and the salary threshold, does not pertain to them. And that was a decision that was made by the Department of Labor. So they fall under the ministerial exceptions. So ministers, again, do not fall under the requirements of the FLSA. So your local pastors, maybe people who lead your worship service, or the song portion of your worship service, they may be considered ministers. And if they are, then again, they don't fall under these specific requirements, but you want to make sure you're documenting that, especially if they're not ordained and they're not considered clergy under the UMC connection. But if they are ministerial in terms of what they do, you want to make sure you're documenting that on the job description and make sure they understand that they are considered in a ministerial role, because that is important for them to understand that and that expectation. So we're going to go into the questions portion. So we will stop recording and then we can pull up the chat.